sitting so that I can ask you to please rise on page 28 for the Baruch Hu, which you made possible. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai Borach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch et Adonai Le'olam Va'ed. Umavir Yom Vein Laila, Magdil Ben Yom Vein Laila, Adonai Tzvot Shemo, El Chai V'Kayam, Tamidim Lachalenu Le'olam Va'ed, Baruch Ata Adonai Hamariv Haravim. Page 29, Ahavat Olam B'Yisrael. V'avatcha Tasmenu L'Olamim, Baruch Ata Adonai, Ohev Amo Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Adonai Elohechem Emet. Malchuto b'ratzon kivu aleihem Moshe Miriam u'bnei Yisrael v'chanesha b'simcha rabba v'amru kulam michamocha ve'elim Adonai michamocha nedar b'kodesh norati lo tosef ele malchutecha ra'u v'necha b'kayam lifnei Moshe ze'eli anu v'amru Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed v'ne'emar kifad Adonai Yaakov u'golo me'achsav mimenu baruch ata Adonai ga'al Yisrael Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom. Ushmor tzeitenu v'oenu l'chaim u'shalom me'ata bi'ad olam ufros aleinu sukat shalomecha baruch ata Adonai hapores sukat shalom aleinu v'al kol amo Yisrael v'al Yerushalayim. Page 34. Vaydaber Moshe amodei Adonai al b'nei Yisrael. Please rise. Yikadal v'yikadashim erava v'yamad v'rakirute v'yamlit malchute v'chayechonu v'yamechonu v'chayeduchol beit Yisrael b'agalav izman kari v'imru amen. Yehesh merava mevarach olam olam el mayam yiparach v'yishtabach v'yipar v'yitramam v'yinaseh v'yitadar v'yitala v'yitalash merukudishah v'yitruhu Le'elam min kol berchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata Da'amiram de'alma v'imru. Amen. Silent Amidah begins on page 41b. Remember to include the insertion at the bottom of where it says Saturday night ad on bottom of 41b, and of course the insertions for Shavuot. יתגדל ויקדש שם רבה, ועמד דברי קראתי וימליך מלכותי, וחייכון ובמכון וחיי דכל בית ישראל, בגלה וזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם עולם אלמיה, יברך וישתבח ויפאר ויתרומם וינשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי לקודשה ברכו, לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תשבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. תתגבר צבאותון ובאותון לכל ישראל, כל אדם ובהון לישמעיה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמעיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. What I'll do is, since it's a little bit before dark, even though we could do kiddush, I'm going to let people do kiddush for themselves at home, which seems to be a good compromise considering the dust that we're in. So let's turn to Aleinu. We're on page 51. Please rise. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon ha'kol, la'ted gidula li'otzer breshit, shelo asanu kegoye haratzot, ולא שמענו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים, לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. Let us remember that outwards. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו Mourner's Kaddish, page 52 for those reciting. Yigadal v'yikadash shemei rabba, v'yalma divrach kirute v'yamlich malchute, v'chayechon u'vyomechon u'v'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, v'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru. Yehe shmei rabba mevarach le'olam u'lamei al-maya. Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitala v'yitalal shmei d'kudisha richu le'ela min kol berchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiran v'ama v'imru Yehe shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru oseh shalom b'mromav Hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Chag Sameach. Thanks everyone who is joining us electronically and joining us in person. So I'm looking around, and I think this might. I want to adjust, given there was no way to predict. 6 weeks ago when we had to design this event, whether what people's comfort level would be for studying in person and at the synagogue. So I'm looking around, and what I'm wondering is, for those who are on Zoom, this doesn't affect you. And I will be seeing you soon for Matrilineality and its discontents. So let me talk to the rest of you, and so I'll see you guys later in a minute. Go get some cheesecake. I'm open to the intellectual firepower that we have in here right now. So I'm looking at the schedule. Actually, I'm not looking at the schedule. Let me grab the schedule. So, in normal times, and I hope I get to say at some point that we're back in normal times. In normal times, this would have been the right schedule, given, usually somewhere between 50 to 70 people, I've seen here in the 2 years before COVID, that we were doing decoding together. Given the numbers we have, so the way we have it designed is that Rob, Lisa, and Zachary each going to teach now, and then teach the same thing again. And that way, we give people a chance to kind of move around. That's usually the way the Tikkun I've been involved in for decades often use that system. But what I'm wondering is, we could do that. We have the numbers to do that. But I'm going to invite Zachary. I'm going to ask you like your opinion too. And I hope you'll just be forthright about what you really think. Another possibility is to have Zachary teach now, and then have Rob Lisa teach the second session. That way, instead of like dividing up the group, Rob Lisa, I'm just thinking, given the numbers, they're not the usual 50 to 80 people like that. I was wondering if maybe, like Zachary would teach the first session, and then you would teach the second session, rather than teaching the same thing twice. Were you going to teach the same thing twice or not?
I am, but mine is, you have to have the knowledge of the Hebrew alphabet, and it's a Talmud class in that world. So
yeah,
I don't want to be the only answer that doesn't feel acceptable.
Well, you know what? In the second session, the Rabbi Joel.
Perfect.
So what it would mean is for the first session, we get to study with Zachary. And I'm not deciding yet. I want to the teachers get to decide ultimately. And then the second session would be Rob Lisa and Rabbi Joel. And then the third session would be Rabbi Joel only. I took myself out of that because I had a sense that we was going to teach third session. I had a sense by that time, maybe we would be down to one session. What do people think of that? You can be honest with me. It's just us. We can decide. Or would you rather like split in half? So Peter's giving me the thumbs up. Zachary, how do you feel about that?
That's fine by me.
You sure, Rob Lisa, are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, very happy to read.
That way it gives us, if we had another 10 people, I said, let's do 2 sessions, which would then might be too big, but I think we split in half, it might feel strange to do the same session twice and just for us. So in that case, Zachary, you are our sole teacher. Are you sure? Okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. And I know you wouldn't embarrass me publicly, so I invite you to do so. So your session is going to be in a small social hall. Why don't I look at the setup? Why don't we go look at the setup for the small and large and see which is more conducive? You decide which of those two places.
Wherever my patrons are is fine by me.
Okay, I think they're in the small social hall. Okay, so we invite everyone into the small social hall for that great session. Zachary, will you send people to cheesecake right at the appropriate time?
Yes.
And then we will gather for a choice between our week's session and Rabbi Joel's session at 9:30. Good morning, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Feels good to be doing some tikkuning. Thanks for joining us, and may our study heal the world. Let's do our blessing for Torah study together, it's for all forms of Torah, the scripture and the sacred writings that we're studying. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Amen.
Amen.
So I'm going to keep it like this, and let me put in the chat area. This is the source sheet today, but I will be sharing the screen. So if you're comfortable looking at the screen, that's great. If you want to see the answers ahead of time and skip right to the answer set, then you can go to the shared document, and then you can scroll ahead and see what's coming up. But otherwise, I'll be sharing my screen with that sheet anyway, so you don't need to click on it. It's nice to see some of you I haven't seen. Some of you I just saw a few hours ago, and some I'm just seeing and haven't seen for a couple weeks. So it's good to see you all. How's see? Put your hands where, like, if you're doing really well, like up here. If you're not doing so well, down here. And if it's Mets and Mets, put it in the middle. So how are people doing? Then I think the Mets and Metses have it. Okay. I want to thank you for coming to this session. Let me tell you a little bit about it, and then we'll jump right in. I'm a little nervous about it. I shouldn't tell you that, but it's true. I wanted to take on a topic that was hard for me because I feel like I like tikkuns that are a little bit experimental, where someone says, look, I could teach from my wheelhouse, but tonight I want to try something I'm not so sure about. And I feel like I feel like I'm back in grad school. So I did a lot of research for this. I was telling Celia on Friday night, the more research I did, the more I felt unqualified to comment on this topic, but it was too late to change it. So I'm going to share what I did. And, I guess I'm asking for the fact that this is not highly polished. It's a topic I think is really, really important. It could be that the study of the sources that I'm presenting won't enlighten us a lot about it. And we may just up having a discussion toward the end that may not relate to the sources, because we could just determine that the sources are very historical in nature and that we want to be free of them in the modern period, or and that's okay too. So at the end, I might just have a discussion that isn't really about the sources, but is about really what I guess I was hoping the sources would reveal more enlightenment for the modern situation. Maybe if they don't, that's also an answer. I guess that's the idea of academia, right? You have a hypothesis and sometimes it doesn't work out. But let's see. Maybe you're going to tell me you're wrong, Nadav. This totally works out. So this is the issue. The issue is that we basically have the old saw, which is that is Judaism patrilineal or matrilineal? What makes a Jew if not both partners who are producing the offspring are Jewish? And most of us know the answer, which is the biblical period is patrilineal and the rabbinic period is matrilineal. And when people ask you, like, why did you change it? The usual answer is Ezra. And we'll look at it in a second. But typically, right, Liz, you're already there. I mean, Liz, I should have you present this. No, so the typical answer is it's because of Ezra, because Ezra said, in the exilic period and the return to the land, put aside those non-Jewish wives and their offspring and send them away. And so usually one typical answer is in a time of intermarriage, Ezra started this, but what was Ezra really doing? Well, the case of you always know who the mother is, but you don't always know who the father is. And so somehow that's what Ezra was about in a time of intermarriage. And so that we switch to matrilineal in those times. And what we'll find out is that that's certainly wrong, all of that. So like, I wanted to know, like, what is the answer? And is there anything we can learn about what the answer is? And here we go. Thanks for joining us. You can always use first of all, you can interrupt me, and then, which is fine. I'm going to try to put some sources out there. And when I ask questions, you can like talk out loud. And you're also, if you're more comfortable using the chat area, this is not being recorded or saved. So even though it's still Shabbat or Chag, it's not a preserved chat area. So in that sense, it's like writing in the sand and kosher for doing on the time when you're forbidden from writing. Feel free to use the chat area. Okay, you've been patient. Here we go. So make sure I put up the right thing. There we go. Good. Who's at Sinai? Matrilineality and its discontents. So one of the things, of course, that's important is to us is that this is Shavuot. We read the book of Ruth. we think of the topic of conversion, we think about what it means to receive Torah and to choose Torah. And so the question that comes up is, who is at Sinai? Because we have this idea that all converts, their souls were originally at Sinai. So this idea of who counts as being worthy of receiving Torah as a Jew in the context of a holiday in which we think of what it means to be a Jew and whether Ruth is a convert or she's not a convert, I wanted to ask, what does that mean? What makes a Jew, especially from a marriage like Ruth and her husband, where only one of them was Jewish and Ruth was not? All of this is indebted to the work of Professor Rabbi Shai Cohen. And Shai Cohen was at JTS for a long, long time, and he now holds, one of the premier chairs in Jewish studies, which is at Harvard University. And his work is amazing. More commonly known in these days is Rabbi Ethan Tucker at Hadar, who draws a lot on his work, and I think should be footnoting his work a great deal more. So much of it is coming directly from Shai Cohen's work, and maybe there's a place where he puts the footnotes in more extensively. All this to incredible, over a decade's worth of research and work from Professor and Rabbi Cohen. Before you just assume that the rabbinic period is matrilineal and the biblical period is patrilineal, remember I just put this as a thinking frame. It still says in the rabbinic period in Bava Batra, the family of the father is considered family. The family of the mother is not considered family, which is really a leftover from the Bible, and it is here reaffirmed. So let's think about what's going on. So we'll start with some history, and we'll try to zoom through it. Here we go. In the pre-exilic biblical period, and it certainly includes the Torah, you don't need me to tell you that you probably do need me to tell you that there's no explicit prohibition on a woman, an Israelite man marrying a non-Israelite woman, except in the case of the Moabites and the Canaanites. And that's very specific. That's not really a case of forbidding intermarriage per se, because as we can see, Judah even married a Canaanite. Joseph, of course, married Asnat, an Egyptian, the daughter of the priest, and gave birth to Manasseh and Ephraim, who are two of the tribes. And Moses, of course, married Tzipporah, and maybe also an Ethiopian second wife. David married a Philistine, and Solomon, he married a lot of people and who weren't necessarily born Jewish. There's no question that all of those children are Jewish, and so we clearly have what looks like patrilineal descent. Although the idea of patrilineality, what does it really mean? Are we allowed to assume it from that or derive it from that? But why? In a sense, why would that be the case? And is it only exclusively the case? Is there no situation of matrilineality? So the first thing to say about it is, if you look at it, it's all about men, right? And in a way, the Torah, the Bible, seems to be directed at the male reader. And so it's not examples of intermarriages, it's an example of men taking foreign wives, right? And bringing them into the fold of living among the Israelites. And it seems, I know that there are texts in the Torah that are somewhat complex, where people are half Egyptian or half this, but I didn't want to include those texts because they actually don't really lead to the places people think they lead. So where are the cases of the offspring of Israelite women and foreign men? Because the Torah seems to be directed at the male the male Israelite reader. We don't seem to get much of that, but it does happen occasionally. And it seems that they were judged matrilineally only if the marriage was matrilocal. That is, only if the foreign husband joined the wife's domicile or clan. So what is underlying the patrilineality of the pre-exilic biblical period? And it seems to be this. Well, there's no marriage, right? There's only acquisition. So that marriage just takes place through an act of intercourse or through other forms of acquiring the woman, but the woman does not have her own agency, in the sense that, first of all, there's no conversion, and there's no marriage ceremony. And so what it means to have a formal union would mean that the woman leaves the house of her father and joins the house of her husband. And so if we go back to the top quote, the family of the father is considered family. The family of the mother is not considered family. So the woman never is a bayit. The woman never is a family. She doesn't have the status of the family. So is the patrilineality of the Bible, of the Torah, really about kinship systems? Like, how do you trace the nationality, the identity of the child? Or is it really about this concept of it's the wife is part of the house of the man. So of course that house is Israelite if it's an Israelite house. And if it's not an Israelite house because the man is not Israelite, then the children wouldn't be Israelite because they are part of that. But we do have cases in the biblical literature where there is matrilocality. So think of, I mean, a house here is obviously a legal concept, but it's also a little bit of a spatial concept, right? And think of now of Ruth for a moment. We have the moment, Ruth and Naomi are there. Go back, Ruth, to the house from which you came. And she's like, no, I will follow you to the Israelite locality. So what it means for her to convert when there's no conversion yet, what conversion is back then for a woman is marriage. And the marriage is also connected to locality. When you think about it, like when she goes and she eventually marries Boaz, she is choosing to live among the Israelites. So what Professor Cohen shows is through a lot of sources I didn't bring in because he actually has, his articles are very long and has books on it, is that there is a principle of basically where the child is being raised and how the child is being raised and in which community the child is being raised. And so I'm going to raise that as a question for us. That's the first concept I wanted to pull out of this, which is, are we so focused on patrilineal or matrilineal, which sounds like a way of deriving bloodlines, or is there an issue of where the child is being raised that has an issue that reflects on their identity? And we have the introduction of that with matrilocality. Okay, I told you it didn't come from Ezra, so now let's get to the exilic period. Ezra. Shechaniah, the son of Yechiel, one of the sons of Elam, spoke up and said to Ezra, we have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women of the peoples of the land. But there is hope for Israel concerning this thing. Let us now make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives and the children born to them, according to the counsel of the Lord, and of those that tremble at the commandment of our God. And let it be done according to this instruction. Rise, this matter is dependent on you. We are with you, be courageous and do it. Ezra got up and adjured the chief priests, the Levites, and all of Israel to do this thing. And they took an oath. Okay, after exacting a pledge from the nobles of Jerusalem to refrain, so it's an oath to refrain from marriages with foreigners, Ezra attempted to expel from the community approximately 113 foreign wives with their children. So, and I want to point out historically, at about the same time, 451 BCE, Pericles was enacting a law restricting Athenian citizenship to those born of an Athenian woman lawfully wedded to an Athenian man. We actually have the rise of duolineality. The requirement that Pericles is that both parents have to be citizens for the child to be a citizen, whereas prior to that, only one of them had to. So given the context of this, is Ezra really introducing a matrilineal principle? Was this a move to duolineality? Was this a prescription for the future? And does Ezra consider the children to be Gentile? Because the mothers are originally Gentile. So I'm going to look in the chat area for a second, just to see, because I got some stuff going on. And so, right, let's put away all the wives. Yeah, it literally means expelling them from the community, or as Liz said, it means to divorce them. And was Ezra successful? Well, the women would go back to their father's house, right? So I mean, yes, I mean they were expelled and had to. It was if it's like annulling the marriages, it's divorcing them, and the men not keeping the children and sending them back. So I kind of gave this away a little bit earlier, but so people take this often. They're like, and even some of the rabbis refer to it, but it doesn't work. Like it's what's going on here is not the principle that we don't know who the fathers are. We only know who we only know who the mothers are. That's not the issue here. These people are married. We know who the fathers are. And actually, basically, in the case of a marriage, if the father didn't accuse the wife of adultery, then the children belong to the father anyway, regardless of where they came from. So this is not a case of in a sense, rejecting them because we weren't sure who the children, who the fathers were. And it doesn't seem to be a prescription in any way for the future. And it doesn't even seem to indicate matrilineality. I mean, actually, it doesn't. There's no real parallel for matrilineality in this time period, in Judaism at the very least, and usually elsewhere often as well, but here for sure. So this is a particular case, and so the children may well be considered in a sense Jewish, although they may end up being matrilocal. So they may end up following the mother once they become part of another man's house. And so it's not the source that we were saying. Good, thank you, Celia. I was reading about this one group that was matrilineal. Right, Ellen's like, I agree. It seems like he doesn't consider them Jewish, but it doesn't say so. And he could have the local thing in mind. In other words, they're Jewish in my house and I'm kicking them out, which sounds cruel to me anyway, and sending them with the mothers. Some people might derive from this as, well, mothers have a big influence over their children, but that's not really attested to as a reason anywhere in the text. Like it's because, kids love their mom and follow their mom. We don't see that anywhere else. But I was wondering, Celia, there was a name like in Latin, and I was like, I don't know who that is, and I think it was the Etruscans. So thanks for the instructions. Okay, so let's go. So the Second Temple period did not know of matrilineality, though it was disapproving of intermarriage. And it is possible that what we're seeing in Ezra to some extent is in a population in which there is a lot of intermarriage. Let's say almost like the majority is intermarried. There's a panic. There's a concern. Ezra is not the source of the rabbinic matrilineal principle. So here it is. Gave you the vowels because I always find it useful in the Mishnah. So now we're at the Mishnah published in approximately 200 CE. And from Kiddushin. Kol makom sheyesh Kiddushin ve'ein avera havalad holech achar hazachar. And so as we go down to the English, and you can, if you want to look at the Hebrew continually, go to the source sheet. And just one more time, I'm going to put it in the chat area in case you joined late. So there we go. If you want to look at it separate from me. But here we go. I'm going to push it up a little bit. Mishnah Kiddushin. Here we go. Okay. Good luck with this, guys. This is the part where I'm like, this broke my brain, and I spent most of the week with this. And okay, I hope you can think better than I do. I'm looking at Bob Blumenthal. I mean, I think you almost need to be like a biologist, to follow. No, because it's or logic. It's a logic puzzle. Whenever there is Kiddushin, potential for a valid marriage. Remember, there's no marriage. There was no Kiddushin. There was no marriage in the biblical period, like in this sense, like a marriage. Well, I should say in the Torah, for a marriage ceremony. And there's no avera of a commandment. There's no violation of a commandment. The offspring follow the father. Okay. What case is this? Well, when a woman of priestly, of Kohen, Levi, or Israelite descent marries a Kohen, Levi, or Israel. Now, it's interesting because you all know, you probably wouldn't be in this session if you haven't thought about it before. Well, it's interesting that we clearly preserve patrilineality with Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael, because if a a Kohen male marries an Israelite woman, then the children are Kohanim. And so here we have the source. I would say this, which is, is it a remnant of patrilineality as I've often thought of it? Or is it more than a remnant? Is it actually part of a more complex system that we haven't been considering? Okay, section 2. Whenever there is Kiddushin, a valid marriage, and Kiddushin can only take place, for example, between two Jews. The issue of doing Jewish ceremonies today and intermarriage, it comes up all the time. Whenever there is Kiddushin and there is Averah, there's a breaking of a mitzvah, the offspring follows the more tainted parent. What case is this? When a widow marries a high priest, or a divorcee marries a high priest, or a woman released from the Levirate bond marries a common priest. When a mamzeret, there's no way to translate that, anyway, I don't know, or a nitina. A mamzeret is, sometimes it's someone born
A bastard.
a bastard. I know, but unfortunately, bastard has a different legal history in the Anglo-Saxon world. So I'll say, how about, does this work, Liz, like the child of adultery? I mean, it's more than just adultery, but that's the main form of it. But it is like a bastard. It's someone who doesn't
It's
have...
the offspring of an incestuous relationship.
And it is also the offspring of an incestuous relationship because there is no... Well, here...
There's no father, isn't it? When there's no
right,
father.
in a sense, there's no father. But here, let's look at this. Here, there's okay. So there is a. It could also be two mamzers marry each other, and they produce a mamzer. So whenever there's kiddushin and there is a violation, the offspring follows the more tainted parent. And this is also, or a Jewish woman marries a mamzer or a natin. The natins were the Gibeonites who were forbidden by King David to marry Israelites. Number 3, whenever there is no potential for a valid marriage. So here we're at incest. Whenever there is no possibility of a valid marriage in the present union, but the woman could have a valid marriage with another man, the offspring is a mamzer, is a bastard or a person of this status, a mamzerut. What case is this? This would be in the incestual relationships in Leviticus. And so in incest, there's no woman or the man could marry someone else, but they can't marry this person that they just had a child with. So the offspring is a mamzer. And 4th, whenever there is no possibility for a marriage, a kosher marriage possible for a woman at all, the offspring follows her. What is this case? The offspring of a female slave or a Gentile woman. So if
But
go ahead.
I mean, slaves got married all the time,
Right,
and their children belonged to the
master.
master.
That's right. That's why there's no kiddushin possible for a slave, because
She can't give consent.
correct, and she can't be acquired. I mean, she can't be acquired by someone else because she's already the property of the master. So there's no possibility for kiddushin at all, and so there's no possibility for Jewish marriage with the Gentile woman and the offspring of a female slave is for this woman at all. This is often considered partly or quoted as the source of the matrilineal principle, but is this really matrilineality or is it something else? So think about this section again as it is let's just say for a moment, it's a primer only for male readers, not for female readers. Number 4 isn't directed to a woman at all. It's talking about the possible marriages for an Israelite man. So when they get to number 4, what if you want to marry a female slave or a female Jewish slave or a Gentile woman? Well, there's no kiddushin. There's no validity in the marriage. If you do have children with her, the offspring follow her. and her status, which would be presumably here Gentile. So one of the things we have here is that this is directed at men. It doesn't okay, and I'll get to Paul in a second. And is this about when is this about nationality or about status? Because when we talk about like, well, if you had Jewish mother, and I'm with people, you're with people. Well, if your mother's Jewish, then you're Jewish. If your if your mother's not Jewish, then you're not Jewish. Are we talking about status according to it, like within the community? Are we really talking about nationality? Are we basically saying this is the kind of thing that would have been on the Russian passport? You're Jewish, you're not Jewish. And isn't there an important difference between understanding Jewishness as a nationality versus understanding it as a status? Go ahead. So
I was just going to point
whoever,
out that there's a total reconstitution of things from the biblical period, because we're no longer talking about tribal landholdings and property and joining a clan and part of that property rights. And this is now talking about the more, I guess, going from a nationalistic to a religious type of looking at things, because it's talking about Kiddushin, it's talking about people's personal statuses and relationships, and it is no longer talking. It's totally divorced from biblical. Although neither one of them is conclusive in terms of matrilineal up to this point. We're talking about a whole different concept of who the Jewish people are.
I don't agree.
No, you don't have to agree. Go ahead.
I mean, I think these are all based on Torah. They all sound familiar to me.
Okay, so good, and trust me, the topic is so hard. I'm not going to be like, you're clearly right, you're clearly wrong. I'm just going to let you comment. But the interesting thing, I just want to go back to the status thing that you just said, is in some ways in the biblical period, it was, well, it's not entirely, it was fairly clear in a way, kind of like nationality, and it also seemed to depend a bit on where you lived. It was not clear that if you move somewhere else that you would still retain the status simply because of your father. You might, but it's not entirely clear. But it's mostly clear in a sense, you follow the father, you're part of the father's house, and so your citizenship status, if there's such a thing, would follow them. Now here we're in a period where there's just a lot about status, a lot about whether you're a bastard or not, a lot about who's allowed to marry someone else. And this goes beyond ancestral relationships. So there are issues, let's put it this way, rather than nationality, we're shifting towards citizenship. What are the rights that you have when you live among a group of people? That's not so much in the biblical period, right? But it's a big issue here. What are your rights depending on your status? And in a way, that's very modern. Like, I feel like in the modern period, we often conflate. We're trying to deal with issues about who's a Jew, and are we talking about what's your nationality? It's binary, or are we also worried about people's status? Like, we want to change it. We want people to have a different status within the community. What is the status of someone who has one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent within the community? That's a different question than citizenship. I mean, and so what are the rights that you have? And now I want to show you something. So Liz, I'll get back to you. I know your hand's up. But so where does this come from? This is pretty interesting that none of this seems to be exactly in the Torah. And so you see these 4 sections, Mishnah Kiddushin. So let's
I was just wondering when this was written.
so
Mishnah Kiddushin.
great. So Mishnah Kiddushin would have been published in approximately 200, and actually we know where it comes from. Ready? It is one of the only sections in the Mishnah, if not the only one, but I can't vouch for that. I don't want to hyperbole, but it may be the only section that is translated directly from the Latin.
Uh-huh.
Here we go. It comes from Roman law, from the same period, from Tituli 5, if you can see that. Kirka 160 is,
Is that Hadrian?
yeah. And so and that's okay, that's silly, I was telling you about this the other day. Okay, connubium in Roman law is the right of marrying a wife. This is the actual text of the law. Roman citizens, translated from the Latin, Roman citizens have connubium with Roman citizens, but with Latins, residents of central Italy, and foreigners, they only have connubium when there has been a special grant to that effect. With slaves, there is no connubium between ascendants and descendants in any degree without limitation. There is no connubium. If I'm understanding that right, that refers to incest. If any man marry a woman whom he is prohibited to marry, he contracts an incestuous marriage, and therefore his children do not come under his authority, but are spurious, or mamzerim, like those born out of wedlock. If there be connubium between the parents, the children always follow the father. If there not be connubium, they follow the condition of the mother, excepting anyone born from a foreigner and a Roman woman, for he is a foreigner from his birth, inasmuch as the Lex Mensia orders that a child sprung from a foreigner on either side shall follow the condition of his inferior parent. The offspring of a Roman citizen and a Latin woman is a Latin from his birth, and that is a free man, and that of a free man and a slave woman is a slave. For there being no connubium in these cases, the offspring follows the mother. So Tucker, who takes this from Cohen, says, if you saw, and I know you need it all on one page to see, and I'm sorry I couldn't make it nice in a chart. I need a personal graphic designer. If this is a direct translation into the Hebrew of the Mishnah, if one substitutes the word connubium for kiddushin, kiddushin being the idea of the right to marry, the right to marry. It's the best way to put it. You change the spurious status just to the word mamzer, because we're like, wait, is that the child of adultery? Why is this status being imported? Why does this apply? Is this really biblical? Is it coming from Ezra? Is it coming from somewhere else? And you change from inferior to tainted. One generates nearly the entire structure of our Mishnah, with most of the legal details agreeing to boot. So if we learn nothing else today, I got to blow your mind with that. So some of the questions that come up for me. Without working out the entire sort of Mendelian genetics of it, does the fact that the source for all subsequent Jewish law on matrilineality copies Roman law almost verbatim, does it matter, or does it not? Does it change your perspective on Jewish matrilineality that the source is not Ezra, not really Jewish, but Roman, to consider? So one possibility is you can say, well, that it doesn't bother me that it's overturning patrilineality, because you could say patrilineality is never listed as a mitzvah. It's not like, and thou shalt be patrilineal. So it's okay. It's okay to overturn it. It's okay that they adopted something from outside. But why might the early rabbis do this?
Yeah.
So I mean, people like Liz have a strong background in different aspects of this, but I don't think you have to have a strong background. So I wanted to invite you to reflect on this, for a few minutes in your own way. So, and I'm going to go to the chat area and look. I'll tell you, some of the things I'm thinking, and I appreciate you having the conversation. Correct. I mean, so Deborah, I'm not going to go to the issue of, but I think the Romans, I don't want to overstate it, but the Romans are very interested in preventing citizenship and the rights attendant to it. And certainly the Romans, and maybe I don't want to just blame the Romans, because I do see Celia here, and I don't want to be too hard on the Romans today. But you're trying to keep children from claiming a heritage. And so a citizen marrying non-citizen, you don't want those children to have the rights of citizenship. So yes, we can graft on issues of who's in whose house, and there is some continuity with the biblical period. But we have these new issues of your rights. What are your rights? And then I think of today. is it again, you're a Jew or you're not a Jew based on who your mom is? Is it as simple as saying it's just binary and we're talking about nationality and look, you can always convert if you really want to? Or are we actually dealing with those issues about what rights does someone have and what is their status? And is this descended from it's very much descended, is this grafted from a system that's trying to deny people to claim the rights of heritage, and certainly to preserve the freedom of Roman citizen men to do as they please, without having to be responsible, for the children. And, and so, and one of the things we see in this is that this is even compatible with duolineality. It could be compatible with the idea that both parents have to be Jewish, full free Jews, in order for there to be the children to be Jewish. So that Tucker suggests, what if Jewishness was understood as a category of belonging that is parallel to other contemporaneous forms of belonging? This is kind of his taking from this, which is, what do you think, Rabbi Tucker, who's become sort of an expert on this? What's being imported here, and in maybe a good way? He's like, well, maybe it's the concept of belonging. What does it mean to belong to the people? Following Tucker, what are contemporaneous forms of belonging today? Does the issue of tainted status affect our understanding of intermarriage today? So I wanted you to hold that in mind, and reflect, and maybe write in chat area. But then, so where did this go in Jewish law? So the Tosefta, which is roughly contemporaneous with the Mishnah, the additional teachings that were not published there, does state, when a Gentile or a slave has intercourse with a Jewish woman and she has a child, the child is a mamzer. So the child doesn't have a claim of ownership on the father, right? Doesn't have a right to claim rights from the father, and also is not a Jew. This is kind of the dirty history of matrilineality. It's rooted in actually saying that the children of Jewish women who didn't marry Jewish men are actually mamzers. And this is a hard thing about being a mamzer. You can't change your status of a mamzer, and you can't marry anyone else but a mamzer. So you are basically in a disgraced status for your whole life. You can't convert out of it, and you can't marry who you want. And so you're in a debased status. And that's actually, it seems to me, although, like I say, it's hard to keep all these balls juggling in the air in logic. It's part of the rooted thing. So here, that's the position. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon, and he goes against it, a mamzer is only produced from a woman with whom the relationship is forbidden and carries a penalty of kari. So he's saying, no, that is wrong. We need to change it. We've inherited this position that the child is a mamzer of a Jewish woman. It's not a Jew. And he's saying, nope, we need to change that. We need to change that child is not a mamzer in this awful status, but is a Jew because it wasn't from adultery. One of the and I said, a mamzer cannot change his status, even if the child is a Gentile from a Jewish woman. At least the child can convert. At this point, conversion is new now in the early rabbinic period, where it didn't exist in the Bible as a ritual act. So I want to give you an example of the Talmudic discussion that goes forth from this. The case comes up, the child of a Jewish woman and a Gentile man. So here we have this issue. We have a debate. Is the child of a Jewish woman and a Gentile man a mamzer or a Jew? Like, happy if it's a Jew, that's today. Yeah, you're fully Jewish. Don't even worry about it. Or, no, you're in a debased status and good luck. You're not even, you're lower in a way than a Gentile. So it comes up. Are they, and so Rav ruled permissively. As in the case where a man came to Rav and asked, when a Gentile or a slave has intercourse with a Jewish woman, what is the status of the child? And the person asking is that child. So Rav said to him, the child is kosher. Forget this mamzer stuff. Totally, you are a kosher Jew. Don't even worry about it. So then the man said to him, then let me marry your daughter. Rav said, I will not. Rav said Shimi ben Bar Chaya to Rav, you know, as the saying goes, I couldn't help but include this because I love it. As the saying goes, camels in Medea can dance in a tiny space. Well, here's the space, here's the camel, here's Medea, and yet we're not having any dancing. He said to him, and so I hope you get it, which is, you know, mixed dancing can lead to more. You know, like, why aren't we dancing if the person is totally kosher? And he said, and so Rav said, even if he were like Yeshua ben Nun, I would not give him my daughter. And he said to Rav, if you were like Yeshua ben Nun, someone else would marry him. In this case, if your daughter doesn't marry him, no one will. Okay, it's a little bit of a comical story of an Agadah, and then the son of the Gentile would not leave. Rav looked at him and he died. Now this is an expression. So I'll just summarize it by using Ethan Tucker's interpretation. I would suggest that the most honest experiential way of describing the positions of Rav and Yehuda and Rav on this matter is that matrilineals are half Jewish. Now, I'm not sure I agree with Tucker on this. Whatever the formal legal pronouncements and theories, these sages treat these men as half in, half out. They're not formally declared mamzerim, but they're kind of treated as such. That's why there's no dancing. And a mamzer, in this case, where the source of the mamzerut is due to Gentile parentage, is effectively a half Jew, partly Jewish on account of his mother and partly Gentile on account of his father. Most painfully for such characters, the sages in these stories seem to want nothing more than for such people to go away. Yet the editorial framework calls this ruling permissively. And one of the reasons I find this so fascinating is now today, how many people who have one Jewish parent, even if the mother is Jewish, feel that they're treated as lower status in the Jewish community, right? I'm not saying we do it, and I know we try to be nice, but when I read the accounts online, of course, people say the darndest things online, but I know that there's a lot of hurt and wounding by people who have one Jewish parent and one parent who is not Jewish, really regardless of whether it's the father or the mother. And they feel like they're looked at differently as potential marriage partners, and they feel like they maybe even have a different status, even though I do think that congregations like ours do a pretty good job. So I'm not trying to say like, boy, we're doing terribly, but I do know how people feel. And so here, I find it interesting that the issues, when you think of it not in terms of nationality, but maybe as status and not great status. I don't know if the half Jew idea is it, but I know what he's getting at. I wonder if we're actually, when we explore matrilineality, we kind of unearth a little bit of the real problems of human nature that we face today. But nevertheless, the lenient rule is established in the halacha. When a Gentile or a slave has intercourse with a Jewish woman, the child is kosher, whether it was born to an unmarried woman or to a woman married to a Jewish man. So even though the rabbis are kind of sort of torn about it when we're being honest about the status, and nevertheless, that position in the Tosefta, which is, no, you're wrong about that. You're not a mamzer, child of a Jewish woman is Jewish regardless of the man, as long as it's not a literal, as long as it's not a biblical case of mamzerut, which is like adultery or adultery or incest. So here we're at the end. I know you didn't think, I mean, I have a lot more text if you want. I have 16 pages, but let's, I think this is probably enough. So these are, there's actually a fifth category. Most of these I've already talked about. If I'm trying to, if I want to relate to how do people feel today? How do we think in our community? It's Shavuot. It's a time we think of Ruth making her choices, figuring out where she wants to be. And we want to put aside the oversimplification that we're matrilineal and we just follow the mother, because we realize its history, its sources are a little strange. And there's a lot of it seems to have to do with status, has to do with who can marry a Kohen. We still have this idea. So the first one is, we saw some evidence for matrilocality, which is, where are you raised? And then I think today, which is there a difference? Let's take a patch. Is there, if a child is a child of one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent, and they are raised not in a non-Jewish community, does it help to say, well, it's matrilineal, so it doesn't matter if, as long as the mother's Jewish, they're fully Jewish. But I'm sorry, if it happened to be that the Jewish parent was the father, they're totally not Jewish. Like, isn't there something to be said for the locality of where they were raised? I mean, I'm not saying we have a right. I just tell you, rabbinic law, as I said, it's right there. Halakha, that the law is pretty clear about matrilineality. I'm not saying it isn't. So the rabbinic law became clear. But if we're going to be able to free think for a little bit, what if we could resurrect some principle of locality because it resonates more with our real experience? Where was child raised? You know, when the Reform movement declared patrilineality okay in the 1980s, they said only in the case where the child was raised Jewish. So they were already incorporating some concept of locality in it, which I think even we forgot that. So I'm interested in that. I'll throw all of these out. So we have 10 minutes to discuss them or 8 minutes to discuss them. Or anyone to put in the chat area what they think. The other concept I already did was belonging. Is there some sense in which where a person experiences belonging should affect their ability, should affect their status today, rather than incorporating this idea? Because in a way, is that what he was saying, Tucker, that we adopt that from the Romans, the sense of where do you belong? Do you belong with the slaves? Do you belong with the citizens? But I still, honestly, as you saw, I hope it's okay to be uncomfortable that our laws are really derived from what seems to me to be the denial of rights to people. There's the issue of women's autonomy, which is yet another thing. It's totally different, which is there was no autonomy for the woman in the Bible, so that she really was, as preserved in principles in the Talmud, we see Kohen, Levi, etc., but that she's always part of a house. So it's the male house that chooses her. There's no ability for her to convert except to marry, because the conversion in the Bible is only transferring houses. Now, for Professor Cohen, for Shai Cohen's work, he thinks this is a very big deal because it was only in the Mishnaic period that the idea of conversion with immersion was possible for women. There is conversion prior to that for men with circumcision, but that's still a little bit complicated in the exilic period. But here, isn't it interesting that these laws of matrilineality are coterminous or have their genesis in the same time period when a woman could choose to convert on her own through immersion? That's established in the Mishnaic period at the same time as this is adopted from Roman law, and he wonders about that. So what I would say about this is kind of like, if you're someone who says, I kind of like matrilineality because please, Rabbi Kane, don't take away the one thing we women have in rabbinic Judaism, right? Which is that we have a connection. It's our status that's passed on. And in a way, he's saying that this is the first time we do have a sense that women are their own persons. And so it's a way of not saying their status is debased, but rather we incorporate a possibility of a category for them to pass on their status, which is prior to that would have only been through a man. And then, so as Shai Cohen says, a crucial context for the development of the matrilineal principle is the ability of a woman to convert apart from marriage. In other words, for her to own herself at all. Does this affect your conviction in the matrilineal principle? So I'm going to open it up. I'm going to stop sharing all of that. I'm going to look at the chat area because I've been missing it. So how are children born out of rape seen? Well, that's interesting because in the Talmud, that's one of the things on my 16 pages of sources that I didn't put in. The case is brought forth to the rabbis of a Jewish prostitute, a woman who is a Jewish prostitute, and it's also, that could be considered a form of rape. I mean, in the context. But in any case, well, actually, I should distinguish the two. I shouldn't conflate any categories when it's this complicated. But the father is Gentile, and that is one of the places where the rabbis say the child is Kosher. The child is a Kosher Jew. And it seems to be because there is no paternity. They're kind of saying the paternity doesn't count, even though we know who the father is. And now that we have the possibility for a woman to have her own status, separate from a man, and that status can be passed on, or the status inherited maybe from her father can be passed on. And children born out of rape are, well, if it's adulterous rape, and if it depends if it's a single person or not, they'd be viewed as mamzerim, if I understand correctly. The evolution of men as nurturing parents makes it pertinent to revise our views, as was the case in the Mishnah adopting the Roman law. What an interesting perspective. The evolution of men as nurturing parents makes it pertinent to revise our views. I want to hold that in mind as I go down. I think there was a lot of movements to distinguish and incorporate Jews into Hellenism. Whether this ruling was originally Roman or Jewish to me doesn't really matter, because if their laws agree, it serves to keep the groups separate and preserve Jewish culture as separate from the Hellenist one. One of the arguments of the historical research of Shai Cohen is that in the Mishnaic period, intermarriage was not an issue, whereas in the exilic period, it was an issue. So that, like, non-Jews and Jews having children was an issue in the exilic period. But he argues that if you actually look, it wasn't a problem for the early rabbis. It wasn't really a problem for the rabbis. Jews were not marrying Gentiles. I thought they would have been. My feeling is if Judea was part of the Roman Empire, that probably was happening. And he argues that only in like Rome and Alexandria could that be happening. But it's not a case. It's not a problem in Yavna or Israel where the Talmud is drawing from the Mishnah. And so I just would throw that out there, that they're putting this in the case where they're not concerned, or the social reality of intermarriage is not happening. And I think we have to think about what being a Jew was and the extent to which a woman was capable without a man of conveying Jewish culture tradition to children. Might we feel differently about all this depending on how much of the content of Jewish observance is home-based versus public forum-based? All of these are really, really interesting observations. Is there anyone who wants to offer an observation orally instead of in written form?
Rabbi,
Go ahead.
I'm really confused by this.
I'm sorry, I am too.
Yeah, going back to those categories of all, if a woman, this kind of relationship is tainted, and this kind of relationship is not kiddushin, but all of the children produced from all those relationships are Jewish, right? Except if the woman's Gentile, all the children are Jewish.
I have to go back to it.
So there were,
right.
A mom's Jewish, right?
Correct.
And what other kind of tainting is there? I mean, the only a child of a slave, if the slave is Jewish, maybe the child is not. So when you talked about two things: Jewishness and status. And so status, a mamzer, as I remember, maybe I don't even know what it is, but they can only marry other mamzerim, and maybe they can't make certain sacrifices, or maybe they can't hold certain offices or something, but they're Jewish, right?
Right.
And the slave might be Jewish. And so only the Gentile woman's child is not Jewish. So
that's, yeah, go ahead.
So really, the matrilineality is already there, right? Is that,
or patrilineality?
Or so both of them. I mean, both of the parents. So you're using the word kash. So the marriage is kasher, or the marriage is kasher.
Well, that's right. The child is kasher. Well, if there's a kosher marriage, meaning there is marriage at all, there's kiddushin, which if there's kosher marriage, right, and then kasher is also a reference to the child being a full free Jew.
So kasher for the marriage that is legitimately kiddushin, and the others are the children are mamzerim, but they're Jewish.
Right. But I mean, this is why I'm confused too, and I'm not the best teacher of it. But it's that if what's adopted from the Romans is sort of it becomes in the Mishnah a manual for men,
Right.
Then all of the so it's weird that we're finding a matrilineal principle in the idea that all these men are having Jewish children. They're just all tainted in different ways if they're not having the best possible marriage, except for number 4. Whenever there is no Kiddushin possible for this woman at all, the offspring follows her. What is the case? A female slave or a Gentile woman. So if she's a Gentile woman and a Jewish man has children with her, they're saying those children apparently are not Jewish. The offspring of a Gentile woman with you, there's no Kiddushin possible for that. That's not a Jewish marriage. And so the offspring follows her. We're assuming what they mean by the offspring follows her is that it's a Gentile.
Right.
Even though it's taken from the Roman law, which is right, because they're basically saying Roman citizens who have sex with people of lesser status don't have to take responsibility for the children, and those
That's
children
what-
don't have claimed
What
any
you were
rights.
saying, the law is written for the men.
Yeah.
And that was clear with the Roman law to avoid giving too many people citizenship.
Right.
But yet the equivalent of civil citizenship in the Mishnah is Jewishness, which it felt like everybody was getting it.
Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah.
The thing is that if a person is a mamzer, he can only marry non-mom. He can only marry other mamzers. It doesn't matter whether he's Jewish or not.
Right. Yeah.
So you don't want to be a mamzer. I mean, you have to ask this woman, is she a mamzer so he can marry her? No. So Rabbi Levi once said, you go to another town where no one knows you and begin all over again.
You should see the way to get out of Mamzerut. That it's just the Talmud. They have this whole thing where one of the rabbis says it's not so bad. You could become a slave, then your status is determined by your master because you have no freedom, and then you're freed, and then you convert and all this stuff. And the other rabbis say, yeah, no, that doesn't work. That still doesn't work. You're not getting out of it. So I know we're at the end of our time, and so let me try to. Hopefully, something positive that comes out of this is this. First of all, you will be some of the few people who know that matrilineality is not simple. You will be some of the few people who know that it comes from Roman law. It's one of the only cases that I've ever seen in all the scholarship, and I'm a novice. So Liz, I'll take that back because Liz may cry me, but this is adopted from Roman law of the time. You will know that it's really dealing with status in a way that I find unpalatable, and so it causes us to have to think. Some of what I draw from that is this. On the one hand, sometimes I feel about today, matrilineal is kind of nice. It's the only thing that women have kind of in Judaism. Judaism is traced through the mother, and I don't mind confessing my real feelings and sentimentality. I feel like, as Philip Roth once said in one of the Zuckerman trilogy books, if it weren't for sentimentality, Zuckerman, no one would pass a glass of water to another human being. So I'm confess my sentimentality, which is that there is something nice about Judaism passing through the mom, and one could save that here for two things that Shai Cohen points out, which is that a woman now is able to have her own status separate from a man, and that's introduced in this period, and she's also capable of conversion. And so one thing is maybe one of the because I think human nature doesn't change. Maybe one of the things that works for us today still works, which is, you know what? If it turned out your mother wasn't Jewish and your father was Jewish, all I have to do is take it in mikvah. That's assuming you're circumcised already. But let's just say, assuming you're circumcised already, pretty much except for a tiny blood drop, we can go to mikvah. So why are people making such a big deal of this? So even today, there's a part of me that's like, look, people have the right to convert. That's amazing. And a woman can convert. So whatever. I mean, let's not, why all the hurt feelings when all you have to do is jump in the lake with a couple of rabbis nearby, and we can be done in 5 minutes. So there's one possibility, which is let's stop with all the wounding of people's feelings. And it's not that hard to convert if you want to be Jewish. Let's say you're raised Jewish, and this does happen. I've had people from the University of Michigan contact me, undergraduates. They're patrilineal, but they whatever. They want to go to services. They want to be accepted in conservative community. And so I take them to mikvah. They've been raised Jewish. They don't have to go through a conversion process. On the other hand, some of the things that come up here isn't the locality important? That how were you were raised? I mean, so what if the mother was not Jewish or never converted, but they're raising, but she's raising a Jewish family, and the biological father is Jewish? Like, really, we're going to say that that person who comes to synagogue and participates in this community, who's local to this community, is not Jewish? I feel like it would be nice to put aside some of the status issues and get back to the locality issues and other kinds of issues, which is, can we be more honest? The hurt feelings are real, because the truth is there's a lot going on here about who is less than others. This idea that maybe some people feel like, when I go to synagogue, I feel half Jewish. And you know what I mean? You know what I mean? Because doesn't matter how the person feels. What's the relationship between identity, which is how you view yourself, and status, which is how the authorities of the community view you. So I wonder if we have some roots in here to think through some of those issues more creatively. That's all I wanted to do tonight, was to get a little bit of the sources under our belt. They are really, really, really hard, because I tried to chart them out in terms of, but like I was saying, like a Mendelian chart, but it doesn't work, because the assumptions for each of the charts, it's not really a kinship chart. It's not a blood chart. There are too many assumptions going on. And as we saw, what actually could be considered patrilineal or matrilineal might have actually been duolineal. They're assuming that the status required that both parents be like Roman citizens, and here that both parents be Jewish. That actually could underlie texts that are read as matrilineal. So with that, thanks for coming to my session on matrilineality and his discontents. I hope I left you discontented. Get yourself a piece of cheesecake. And our next session, I want to let you know, is with Jenny Trigg, and it's called The Secret History of Milk and Honey. And
I have a question.
sure, and you can stay on if you're not grabbing a cheesecake, because we have till 9:30 for Jenny. So Liz, go ahead.
But you haven't told us why the Talmudists copied Roman law.
Do you know? I mean, according to Shai Cohen, I mean, he has a couple books on it, and I read a ton of his articles. So he runs down several. I mean, you may have an answer. I'll tell you what he says, because I think he's really, really smart, and I enjoy his work, even if it's very hard to understand. So he basically says that he thinks there are two likely possibilities. I'm trying to remember. One of them I didn't bring up, which is that what the Roman laws, like, how does the Roman laws make sense with the Jewish mentality? Let's not do it like historical, like they were forced to adopt it or something like that, because it doesn't seem like they would have been forced to adopt it. So why would they adopt it? How would that mix with the Jewish mentality? Since we don't, when you go back to all these things, oh, don't marry the Moabite women, and oh, Ezra was upset, and oh, there's this, and oh, there's that, it doesn't work. Even for the rabbis know it doesn't work. You know what kind of works is Tractate Kilayim, which is the rabbi in their mentality are obsessed with mixtures. They're obsessed with the Torah sections on what it means to mix different species. Gosh, back to Mendel, right? And this kind of makes me uncomfortable, because it's just an area I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with. You can't mix the wool and the linen. Shatnez it's a terrible thing, and it's an important mitzvah. You can't sow two seeds in the same field together. And they're kind of horrified by donkeys and mules and all of this kind of stuff. They have they're creeped out by genetic mixtures. So he thinks one possibility, although he's not saying it's true, one of the two possibilities is that this fits into a Jewish mentality of forbidding mixtures. And one of the reasons is that I think some of these texts are in my 18 pages. Actually, they may not be. I think that would have taken more pages. Is that if you mix a like a oh gosh, help me with this like tech, whatever, zoologist. If you mix a horse and is it
A donkey, you
a
get a
donkey, and then
get a
you get
mule.
and you get a mule, is that right? Okay,
Yes, and
if you
mules are sterile.
right,
And
so
mules are sterile, right?
if you mix, so if you mix them, the status follows the mother.
You're a
So,
donkey?
yeah, I mean, I could get out the. Oh, I don't have the time. I mean, I might have the time. Yes, but basically, it doesn't graft. It doesn't graft on perfectly to the Roman law, but they're parallels. So the idea, the rabbis are kind of creeped out, and then in terms of who can mate with whom for things that are not sterile. So when you mix two species and they could mate, who they can mate with is determined by who their mother is. So like they're saying that the matrilineal principle, drawing it in from the Romans, could have to do with a Jewish mentality of being the male rabbis being creeped out by mixtures and having the sense of preserving this like dignity or holiness to purity, and then seeing these cases along the lines of matrilineality. It doesn't work perfectly, but it is a good theory. I think Tucker mentions it, but mostly dismisses it. And I'm trying to remember, like, I mean, the other issue is the one that we already, the other, description is just the one that we really said, which is that basically the concept of, in a sense, Jewish citizenship is sort of new. Like it used to be, if you were part of a male household and you lived somewhere, you had those rights. And maybe, if Ruth had kids and gone and lived over with the Israelites, then the kids would have had Jewish rights. They wouldn't have had Jewish rights, but not now in the early rabbinic period. In the rabbinic period, the real question is, regardless of where you live, do you have rights? And so that's a new concept of citizenship that the rabbis needed to make room for, even within Jewish communities. And so they incorporated it. My problem with that is, I mean, maybe it's a bad problem. Maybe it's not a problem at all. They're so obsessed with the Kohen, Levi, and Israelite stuff, and even the interbreeding of Kohen, Levi, and Israelite, that who do you have a right to marry, and what your rights are. Maybe it fits, but those are really the two models. You're talking about the rights of citizenship, which maybe I should have added as another category for us. When someone says to me, I don't know how to feel in your community, and I think I'm going to go over to Beth Emeth because I just feel like conservative Judaism, no one takes me seriously. Even if my mother's Jewish, I don't feel like I'm really, I mean, they're talking about their feelings. Maybe we need to think of it less as like you're born into the Jewish tribe, you're a Jew, and more think about it in terms, maybe it would be helpful to think about in terms of citizenship. Like what is your status? What are your rights? What are your responsibilities? And how are they conferred? So those are the two sort of general areas that he sees as being. But he doesn't think it's a problem in intermarriage. He thinks he doesn't think it's a sociological reality that a lot of Jews, either men or women, are marrying a lot of non-Jews. He doesn't see that as a historical reality of the Mishnaic period, although he does see it as an issue in the Second Temple period. Yeah, I mean, I kind of miss the biblical period in a way, which is, my God, I mean, I don't miss it because of the rights of women are so diminished and their status is determined by the house they live in. But there's a part of me that misses the idea that the way I was raised and what community I live in, what house I was born into, that's important, rather than the fact that my mother never converted. I'm telling you, well, maybe I did my job. If you are as confused as I am, then, and you may be less confused, you may have understood subtleties in the literature I didn't pick up on, but I'm really concerned about this issue. There's I'm looking for a paradigm, that even if I have to stick with the halakha of matrilineality, because it's been established for almost 2,000 years. Nevertheless, I'm looking for a model to relate to people's identity as Jews who are raised Jewish, even with one non-Jewish parent, and as a part of the Beth Israel community and the conservative community. And I don't want them to feel like second-class citizens. And I sometimes think the emphasis on saying, oh, well, if the mother's Jewish, you don't have to worry. I don't know if that's the way they feel. And I don't know if that the identity matches the reality. Thanks so much. Also, By the way, since I've half a minute left. Oh, Sarah, go ahead. I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, if the point of the commandment to not marry non-Jews is, and I'm reading and I'm interpreting, I'm assuming that it's because God wanted to make sure that, there was a perpetuity, I'm sorry, of, over generations of consistent Jewish faith and, practices. So if you have a non-Jew who is completely committed to that, then, and that is not necessarily sabotaging that in any intentional way, then obviously it's easier if you have, the ideal situation is two Jews who believe and are raised and whatever, and it's all good. But if you have sort of another edge case and it's still working, then, it seems like behind, all these sort of wranglings is this other problem of, trying to kind of fit laws and very specific cases into the, kind of missing the intention. Does that make sense? I don't know if I worded that right.
I think so. I think so. I think it's just so interesting as we sit around and we read the Torah together constantly. And it basically, there's no concern that a Jewish man, at least, would marry a woman who may even still be like Rebecca, carrying her gods along with her. God, no way I'm leaving home without my gods and putting them in the saddlebags. And that, but the interesting thing is like that, I don't know. I am, reading and living that Torah, there does seem to be a simplicity to that now we no longer have with all of these complications. That like I wish the commitment. That's a bad example because she's got her gods, but like I wish the commitments that you're talking about were as important as the birth status. Does that make sense? That like that should count. That like where someone comes from is less important than the commitments that they have in the family and in the community. Of course, I know that's based on kind of a sexist paradigm, and that's part of the problem with it. But for the rabbis, but I do pine a little bit for those times. And then the rabbis have to make up that everybody was converting secretly, and their reasons for that. But I never liked those midrashim. With that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to you, Jenny. Let me make you maybe you already are a co-host.
Yeah, she
Great.
is.
Awesome. Jenny, thanks so much. We look forward to your teaching. Go right ahead.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you for having Nadav. That I took particular interest in your talk as a child of a union of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. And I had the conversion, but even at the time, I felt like I thought of it as like gender confirmation surgery, that I already knew who I was and I just had to make my reality conform to my own identity. So that was very interesting and I got a lot from that. Thank you. And I'll be reading, we went and found our Shai Cohen, so I'm going to be reading this after to follow up on what you piqued my interest on. So I will be talking about milk and honey and what we mean when we say milk and honey. A little spoiler alert, definitely not honey, maybe not milk. And I want to start off by noting that this is the phrase that is used to describe the land of Israel. I think 16 times in Tanakh proper, another 15 times in various writings, Eretz Zvat, Chalav Udvash, which is puzzling to me for a number of reasons. In particular, these are two foods that we have really good reason not to associate with the Jewish people. So first of all, honey, dvash, we normally think of bee honey. Bees aren't a kosher insect, so very strange that would be a symbol of the Jewish people. And then chalav, milk. And I think the numbers, the rates of lactose intolerance among the Jewish people, it's something like 60 to 80% for Ashkenazim, very similar rates for Sephardim and Mizrahim. I am in that cohort. Raise your hand if you are as well. I'm curious if, I see some hands coming up. if we're representative, yes. Jews tend not to have, it's called lactase persistence, is the ability to digest milk into adulthood. And in fact, it's become so closely associated with white supremacy, that ability, that white supremacists have taken to making TikTok videos of them shirtless chugging milk to prove that they, they're of superior stock and can continue to digest milk, which Jews cannot. So why did milk and honey become synonymous with the land of Israel? And do we even mean milk and honey? While we're talking, I'm going to link in the chat to a Google Doc, which has not quite all, but most of the mentions in Torah of that phrase. And I'm going to give a little introduction, and then we can look at those and consider what Torah is trying to show us with that phrase. So I'm going to start, first of all, with honey. So first of all, Torah does not mean honey as we know it. Although the word is dvash, which is used for honey in modern Hebrew, what Torah is talking about, pretty much all commentators agree, is date or fig honey. It's fruit syrup, essentially. And how do we know this? Well, one, Talmud comes right out and says it. It says, here, dvash is honey flowing from figs and dates. Date honey is still widely consumed throughout the Middle East. It's called stilan. I've seen it sold under the brand name Davash at Meyer. So it's still around if you want to try it. It was much more widely available. Honey was, although there was some beekeeping in Israel, and archaeologists have found more recent evidence of that, it was not widespread. But date cultivation was. I thought about making the silan while we were talking, but it takes several hours, so I'm not going to do that. But you can make it for yourself, or you can buy it. And if you're curious what the dates tasted like, that's something we now have evidence of as well. A few years ago, some horticulturists in Israel planted some seeds, date pits that were found at Masada, and were able to actually produce date trees that in turn produce dates. And in the past few years, to a great shechianu, people were able to consume them and reported that they're less sweet than the dates that we kind of, that we know, but nonetheless delicious. And if you're curious and you want to try them for yourself, the closest analog is called the Zahidi date, and that is available if you can't get your hands on some Masada dates. So we know that we're talking about date honey. What about bee honey? Also in Tanakh, also used, referred to by the same term, which is dvash. But every time that it is mentioned in Tanakh, it's clear from context that we're talking about bees. It's only mentioned a few times, and in every case, we're given clues talking about, hives and bees in the very verse. So we know when we're talking about bees, and we're not talking about bees here. However, at some point, honey does become more widespread in the land of Israel, and it certainly becomes beloved by Jews. By the Middle Ages, it's become incorporated into a number of Jewish customs. I'm sure you know many of them. For instance, eating apples dipped in honey for the new year. There was a tradition which I think has largely died out, but still holds on in pockets of the Jewish world, which is dipping either a sheep or a cow's head in honey and consuming that. And on this holiday in particular, traditional to introduce a child to the study of Torah by having them lick honey off Hebrew letters to associate Torah and learning with sweetness. In fact, there's a verse in Song of Songs, milk and honey shall be under your tongue, which is supposed to represent Torah learning, that these are foods that are associated with Torah learning. But we still have a paradox, right? Because this food that is beloved by Jews and has become closely associated with Jewish tradition still comes from a non-kosher animal, a non-kosher insect. So why does honey get a pass when other foods that we secretly may love, like caviar, or may not love, like camel's milk, why don't they get a pass? All right, so there are a few reasons. Shulchan Aruch says honey is kosher, full stop, doesn't give a reason. Talmud gives 2 reasons. So it says, first of all, as far as halakha is concerned, a food is only considered an animal product if it's actually produced inside the animal. So bee honey, they say, it's not really produced inside the animal. It passes through the animal, but it's basically flower nectar that goes through a minor change on its way through the bee, but the bee doesn't really produce it. It's the same principle, for instance, that would allow you to, if you've seen the movie Ratatouille, if a rat prepared a non-kosher meal, prepared a kosher meal for you, it would be perfectly fine to eat, even though the rat himself is not kosher. It doesn't matter. He is not producing the food inside his body. So Talmud says it's fine because it's not made of bee. So it's the science we now know unclear. But in any case, the Talmud gives us another out and says there's a honey exception in Leviticus 11:21, which defines a few swarming insects that are okay, and it says honey comes under that heading, so honey's fine, we can eat it. And there's one other example of a food with similar status. There's actually 2, but I'm going to start with the first one, called honeydew. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, not the melon. But honeydew is a scale that's produced by certain all non-kosher insects, like aphids, some bees, and it's a sweet syrup found on leaves produced by these insects. And in recent years, people started thinking that's what Torah is talking about when it mentions manna, man. Now, we don't know. In fact, the word man basically means, what is it? It's man is Aramaic for what? We don't know what it is. But the description in the Torah of manna really closely matches this honeydew that's still produced throughout the Middle East, still consumed. There's I believe, Iraqi dessert called the manna from heaven, which is like a fudge made from this man syrup, produced by very unkosher insects. So why is that kosher? So a few reasons. One, there's this, I'm not a kashrut expert, but I believe in general, there's a presumption that if a food is kosher until proven otherwise, much like the American judicial system. If we don't know it's non-kosher, it's going to be presumed, especially if it's a new fruit, it's going to be presumed to be kosher. The other reason is God told you to eat it, so you eat it. So automatically kosher. The third reason is that it was before Sinai, before we got the kosher laws, so that's okay. I'm going to point out that there's another food also produced by a non-kosher animal that is kosher, and that is obviously breast milk. And that is the one other big exception. And it was also debated somewhat. Is it kosher? Why is it kosher? The rabbis ruled that yes, it is kosher. Not only that, it's parv. So you, while you probably would not make a cheeseburger with it, you don't have to, if you keep kosher, any bottles you use to give your infant breast milk, you don't have to separate them from meat dishes. It's parv. They were also careful to rule that while kosher for adults to consume, only kosher if you consume it from a vessel, not from the actual source. So that brings us to the other food, honey, or milk. And so first of all, are we talking about milk? And why is this particular food so closely associated, one, with the Jews, and two, with this holiday in particular? So milk has been associated with Shavuot since at least the Middle Ages, at least the 14th century, not clear why. So some people claim that it's derived from the numerical value, the numerical value of the Hebrew letters of the word chalav, 40. And since Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, we eat foods with milk. Another theory is that at Sinai, Jews got the kosher laws. Suddenly eating meat became much more complicated, so it's easier to eat dairy. In memory of that, we eat the dairy just as the Israelites did. I've also seen the explanation that Mount Sinai, the rock looks white, and thus became associated with milk. We eat milk for that reason. And then there's also the Song verse describing the Torah, honey and milk under the tongue. Whatever reasons, mostly I think just Jews like dairy. We invented the dairy restaurant. We like our schmear, we like our blintzes and our kugels, even though it's something that we consume at our own peril. I myself have had probably 8 lactate today. And if you're wondering, lactate was invented by a Jew, by Alan Kligman, a true mensch and friend to the Jewish people. He also invented Beano, for those who have trouble with trolling. All right, so we have a quick clip that Rob is going to play for us, commenting on this. This might take 1 second. Thanks for. All right. Thanks for being patient. All right. And while we're bringing that up, I'm going to ask us to think about why we have this connection to milk that we don't have to say like orange juice. This is deeply held, and it's not just Ashkenazim. Sephardim also have beloved dairy recipes for the holidays, especially for Shavuot. It's widespread throughout the Jewish world and has been for over 1,000 years, even though we all have a bit of a problem digesting it. All right, this might not work. All right, so we'll keep going. We'll come back to that. So first of all, is chalav milk? Not necessarily. So Rav Margolish thought that chalav in Torah referred not to dairy milk, but to white wine. And he pointed to a few examples. So the use of it in Song of Songs, there's some commentary that there it definitely means white wine. And he pointed out that other uses in Tanakh, when we see the word chalav, it could well be referring to white wine, that there's nothing about it that specifically makes it clear that it's dairy. If it was dairy, it was definitely not cow's milk. And we know this for a few reasons, although cattle was cultivated in Israel. In fact, tomorrow morning, we'll read about bringing cattle for sacrifice. They weren't milked, at least not widely. The dairy production was exclusively sheep and goats. So, and note that sheep and goats milk are easier to digest for a lot of people. And because ancient Israelites needed to consume milk in forms that didn't require refrigeration and that traveled well, they ate fermented forms like cheese and yogurt and butter, which were also easier to digest. I want to look now at Kabbalah. So what does Kabbalah say about milk and honey? And one thing that Kabbalah notes is in Kabbalah, there's a connection between, as there was in much of the ancient world, between milk and blood. So Kabbalah holds that milk comes from blood, which would be problematic, right? We know blood is not kosher. We can never consume blood. And this is commonly how I know we have several classicists on, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that it's sort of a tenet of medicine in the classical world, and I know this was a belief held by Hippocrates and Galen and Aristotle, that certainly breast milk was blood made white by heat. So there's this connection between blood and milk in the classical world, also in Kabbalah. So why is milk kosher and why is honey kosher? So Kabbalah teaches that even though honey comes from an animal whose divine sparks aren't evident, bees, and even though milk comes from a source, blood, also divine sparks not evident, that they are kosher because they are an example of how holiness can come from an unholy place. And that is, so these make this sort of extra holy, right? That it is an example that we need to emulate in our everyday lives, trying to find holiness in the unholy. And now I want to turn to the one word we haven't defined, which is the flowing. So zvat in the verse, and point out that this is it. No place in Torah does vat mean overflowing. In fact, when it's used, normally it's much closer to discharge. It's almost always used to describe a bodily secretion from a sick person. So it's closer to secretion, to discharge, to hemorrhage. It does not mean bounteous, healthy, overflowing promise. It does not generally mean blessing. So I want us to kind of look at some of these verses and ask, is a land flowing with milk of honey, is it a blessing? Is it a curse? Is it a promise? So take a minute and look at, will you share the screen? Look at these verses and let's consider exactly what, okay. All right, so you can click on the Google Doc and look at some of these verses and consider, is it a promise? Is it a threat? Is it a blessing? Or is it different from context to context? Feel free to jump in, or you can add your comment in the chat. So I think it's clear that it varies. It's not necessarily a blessing. And in fact, some scholars have argued that it's not a blessing at all. And that milk and honey are two foods that are consumed in time of scarcity because they're around when the crops fail. That it's much less a promise than a threat, much less a blessing than a curse. And I think that's particularly relevant to consider now in a time of climate change that will directly affect both honey production, especially bee honey, and milk production, and what that means for the land of Israel, what it means for the earth as a whole. And Akiva Wolf, Rabbi Akiva Wolf has written about this, specifically looking at Parshat Vayelech, which is another one of the times this is used, and pointing out that the flowing in milk and honey, it comes with a warning, and reminds us that when the Jews settled Israel, there was a ban on the raising of small livestock like goats and sheep in the land of Israel, particularly in the settled areas, because this is one food that directly benefits the pastoralist, but comes at a great cost for the general population because it requires a lot of grazing area. So this is where we get tragedy of the commons, right? The idea that it's maybe good for individuals, but it's not good for people as a whole. And interesting that it should be, in particular, these two foods that directly illustrate the tragedy or the potential for widespread famine. And do you view it that way? Does it change your perception of the meaning of the verse, that in fact it's a warning that we need better stewards?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So like in this idea that like the milk of, let's say, goats and presumably cattle, is available in a time of scarcity.
Mhm.
Like I'm embarrassed to ask this question, but like I know today cows have to be kept impregnated to produce milk. When they had their flocks, did they have a lot of milk available, or I guess the animals were pregnant a lot? If you have cattle or you have sheep or whatever, is there milk in abundance, or is it actually like, oh, we got to ration it out because there are only a couple who are pregnant right now? Did you know how that works? Like, is it available in scarcity?
Yeah, I don't know how that works. I know that like Wolf's interpretation of the verse, and also I think it's Eitan Levy from Hebrew U, that it's pointing to the failure of the crops, that because there's no agriculture. Worth noting also that Torah kind of marks the passage of time from more of a pastoralist people to more of an agricultural people. And so this is a step back, right? So that we messed up the crops, we can't rely on that, and we have to, in fact, and then we have to now return to this other food stuff that it can be the food of hardship. And not the food of a plentiful harvest.
No, I mean, it is fascinating because you're right. I mean, like when they're going from pastoralists, I mean, they're basically herders and shepherds, to think that, but you'll go to a land where there's lots of milk from those animals. You're like, well, that's what we have. So it is kind of, I never thought of it as kind of either ironic or certainly somewhat enigmatic potentially.
Right. So Harvey, I noticed that you flagged Deuteronomy 31, a land flowing with milk and honey, they will eat and be satisfied. Was there something that resonated in that for you?
It's hard for me to equate the concept of milk and honey with scarcity when it says they will eat and be satisfied and live on the fat of the land. Those seem to be directly linear. Milk and honey produces abundance, or is a sign of abundance, as I read that.
Right, and it's also analogous, certainly in this instance, to these are foods that God gives you, right? That agriculture is something that you produce, but a land flowing with milk and honey is entirely dependent on God's gifts to you. So again, like manna and also like breast milk, right? That this requires no participation on the part of the recipient, that it is a gift to you, and that you are a beneficiary of this abundance.
And then it might be temporary.
Yeah. There's also a sense in Judaism that in the Kabbalistic interpretation alliance with this, that this is sort of our version of lemons into lemonade. That something that shouldn't be kosher is kosher, something that shouldn't become closely associated with the Jewish people does. And it's a strange example. So we're going to queue up another example of, we're going to try, no?
No,
we cannot, no.
We would have to shut down Zoom. So
Oh, okay. So is anyone familiar with the Broadway musical Milk and Honey? So I was going to play it for you. It is a very strange musical. Talk about art from an unlikely source. So this is, it was Jerry Herman who wrote Hello Dolly. It's his first musical, or his first Broadway musical. It is it's from 1962, and the plot follows, the plot is, and I am not making this up, it follows a busload of Jewish widows who come to Israel looking for husbands. And it features songs including a hymn for Jaime. It is very strange, very funny. It starred Molly Picone. I encourage you afterwards to go watch bits of it on YouTube. It is in the chat. There have been a couple of revivals for obvious reasons. I think it won't catch on, but it's also very relevant to this holiday because it heavily borrows from the Book of Ruth. One of the characters is named Ruth, and there's a plot involving a widow remarrying, and it much like milk and honey itself, it shouldn't work, but it does. So I was going to close by playing that first, but we're having some technical issues. So instead I'll ask, does milk and honey have any resonances for you? Has, in fact, the tradition of consuming these foods worked? Do they bring you closer to Jewishness, to holiness?
They do for me. I mean, they really do. I've only seen it as a good thing because, you know, Lynn makes fun of me, but I just love dairy products. I mean, my single favorite food is, you know, it's the old thing. If you could be on a desert island, what would you have? Just cheese, just lots of cheese. I love cheese and I love dairy products. I still drink milk. I think one of the greatest gifts from God is that we're able to digest milk beyond adolescence, or beyond childhood. And so, and I love honey and Jewish holidays. You know, it's interesting in preparation for my session, when I mentioned earlier, like, where does marriage start? Like a marriage ceremony instead of just acquisition. I think Cohen points out, like, one of the earliest examples we have is actually that the ceremony was sharing honey, bee honey. Yes, it was that, and I don't know where he got it. I mean, it's from something. It would either be I think it was intertestamental, or Second Temple. There was an example where the couple would share a honeycomb. They would eat from the same honeycomb, and that was the marriage ceremony. So apropos.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Excellent. All right, and we got an answer on from Shimon. Jim, I understand that mammals continue to lactate as long as the demand exists. That is, if the animal is milked, then the glands continue to produce milk. All right, so that answers our question about in times of scarcity. All right. Oh, and a good another good cultural reference, Dizzy Gillespie at the Eilat Jazz Festival, doing an 8-minute riff on Eretz Sfat Chalav Udvash. I highly recommend you listen to this song. It's pretty crazy and it will stick in your head for days. I can't believe that I'd never heard of it, and I also can't believe it exists. It's pretty campy. Thank you, Rav Nadav, for your admission that cheese is your favorite food. I will share that I tell people cheese is my favorite food. It's actually butter. And I read with great interest in the Sonsino Tanakh when I was about 12. And there's a very puzzling passage where it's one of the times we see milk mentioned in the Bible, and Abraham, the visiting angels come to Abraham, and he serves them calf and milk and curds, and the curds in my version was translated as butter, and the footnote read, in ancient times, butter was served on its own as a main dish, which fascinated me and continues to fascinate me, though I'll point out that in Eitz Chaim, they say, no, it was yogurt. So I don't know. I requested a book on the history of butter to try and find out, to share with you all, but it did not arrive in time. So the mystery remains. But that's another passage that's interesting because it's another example of where the rabbis just tie themselves in knots, trying to make something kosher that on its face is not kosher. So like honey, like blood, it's this weird example where we're told exactly what Abraham serves, and it's meat and milk. And there are a number of explanations to what it might actually mean. You know, there's the before Sinai, before kosher law, so it's fine. And then there's a lot of tying themselves to knots, saying, oh, no, that you know, they ate it in the right order, or that because they're angels, the laws didn't apply. But it's another example of trying to make something kosher that on its face is not.
Just like Israelite men marrying
right.
Midianite women.
Yeah. Well, I'd be happy to continue and discuss the.
Celia has her hand up.
Oh, great. Celia, what did you want to share?
Oh, there we go. Okay. I feel I'm about to reveal ignorance. I'm way out of my league here on this, but I will revert to the Romans, which is my territory. And so in Latin text, there's some very poignant references to cattle not being able to feed their offspring in times of famine. So if people aren't eating, cattle are also not eating. So they're also not lactating as they should and not feeding the calves as they should. So I have to say, I don't buy the argument that somehow milk is associated with times of scarcity. But for the Romans, milk is very heavily marked as something that is ancient and that rustic people do. And so, and I don't know the Jewish texts well at all, but I'm wondering if milk is marked in some way, has some associations that are not obvious to us, and that is why they choose to identify it as a land of milk and honey.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I too, I mean, maybe Rob Nadav can fill us in there. I can only come to it from the European perspective, where milk was so connected with virtue that if you chose a wet nurse for your child, she had to be, you know, it was believed that she would provide not only nutrition but spiritual qualities, and so it was important that you found you know, a good moral upstanding wet nurse. And this became a real problem, especially when syphilis became widespread among wet nurses who, you know, never mind bad virtue, but were actually giving syphilis to the children, in which case animals were pressed into service. And the moral standing of animals was actually debated. It was decided that goats were the most moral animal, and in foundling homes in particular, they served as wet nurses, and children would be placed right at the teat to nurse directly from goats, because the wet nurses had syphilis, and this was before, you know, rubber nipples, before baby bottles, and so goats stood in. But there was an association with milk and purity and morality. Rav Nadav, is there an association in Torah in general with milk and other qualities?
Not that I know of. I mean, like, you know, you've gone through the text, so, you know, and even in Kabbalah, you know more than I do right now about that. It's interesting. I never, yeah, I don't know of any connection between milk and purity but I've never searched for it like you have. It's fascinating. I mean, the only relation I had to it was just the, you know, for those who study with me, they hear it a lot. You know, I'm definitely very, very, very convinced that like much of Israelite religion is based on us being shepherds and goat and sheep keepers, and then later cattle, but largely goats and sheep, and that. So therefore, the kinds of diet, the you know, the shepherd diet would have been really held in high esteem, and so in that sense, dairy products are so key, you know. And then culling the herd occasionally. Jim and I have had a lot of these conversations, like culling the herd occasionally, but not constantly, particularly for festivals, for shared public tribal banquets, meat would be the treat. But yeah, I mean, just living on, you know, lentils, and also, you know, the product. You know, yeah, I mean, some grain, probably mostly barley, but a lot of times tree products like dates, you know, and even though dates were cultivated, and figs, but, you know, you're talking about figs, dates, pomegranates, olives, products of trees, plus a lot of dairy. And that I just felt like they're held in high esteem because they are our tribal diet, but I don't know about the moral associations.
Yeah, I don't know. The only thing I know, was looking it up in my giant Hebrew dictionary, is that echema, the word it used in Torah for butter and used in modern Israel for butter, they have the same linguistic quirk we do, that to butter someone up, it's the same word, and so there is this association of with butter with oiliness and flattery, that we have in English. But not with milk, but specifically with the curds. And then on that last page of quotes, the Google Doc, it talks about curds and honey, not milk and honey. So I don't know if it's like a curdled goodwill, curdled blessing. But there does seem to be possibly some association with the turning of a blessing of the milk of loving kindness.
Well, maybe next Purim or whatever, we can have the great debate, the olive oil butter debate, and see who wins.
Schmaltz, right? That's
Or schmaltz.
the other very Jewish fat. Yeah.
Jenny, do you have any oh, go Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I've always kind of wondered why we're not supposed to have like dairy with chickens when chickens cannot possibly lactate. And so it's a little off topic, but I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, that has always bothered me too. And in particular, why we can't have chicken with eggs, because that really seems criminal, but totally kosher. It's rabbinic. I don't know too much more about it. Rav Nadav, it's
Yeah, I
why
mean,
is that
and
allowed?
Jenny, you and I are 100% in the same boat. To me, it's one of the mistakes. It's Mishnaic. I mean, it's early rabbinic, and it doesn't. I it may be one of just a handful of cases where I really think the rabbis got things wrong, and I'm not sure why, because they're smarter than I am. So, but clearly, um, fowl and eggs should be prohibited, based on several places in the Torah that we all know. But it was a debate, and it seems to be, to me, a matter of oral tradition. That I mean, where it comes to oral Torah, which is, it seemed like at some point pre-Mishnaic, it was that became the tradition, and so they didn't give really a lot of reasons for it. I will say this, which is that I found this interesting, that um, in the discussions about what a Mara Da'atra is, the discussions about what it means for someone to be, to be the halachic judge for a small jurisdiction, like a synagogue or a town, and what it would, when in the discussion, so what is it, does that mean they can vary from what the rest of the Jewish people do? The story is of the rabbi who declared that it is kosher to eat poultry with dairy. And that, so they say that, for example, there's this one rabbi who goes by that, and then it says that God praises him for sticking to his position, even though all the other rabbis disagreed. So
That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And it also makes me think more about eco-cash fruit. That if the whole point of the ban on meat and milk is to arouse mercy, remind us the ethical consequences of what we eat, then eco-cash fruit becomes, hard to argue against, especially in a time of global warming and threatened supply chains, which are have become a crisis right now with the formula issue.
That makes sense.
Could doves being a sacrifice at the temple weigh in on the chicken? Chicken smothered in butter was a delicacy in Sfat. Oh my gosh. My husband's been reading about the mystics of Sfat all day. That did not come up. It's fascinating. Wow.
Tikva Kensky taught that lesson.
Wow. Wow. So sort of a chicken Kiev. Wow. That is
2,000 years ago. Yes.
it was very common, because they were the chicken of the time, and so like people who couldn't afford meat would bring the offerings of I guess it's doves. It's often translated pigeons. I don't know why, but whatever you say it is. Yeah.
Wow. I know they found a lot of pigeon carcasses near the Temple Mount, didn't they? That it probably not consumed a lot for at home, but certainly used a lot in sacrifices.
I was wondering if you have any opinion more about the dairy on Shavuot. I mean, I put the link to Lincoln's piece about it, which he covers a lot of sources in there, but he covers, I've always been partial, because you guys all know I love coffee, to the fact that the Tikkun Leil Shavuot seems to have arisen, if I have it right, in roughly contemporaneous with the introduction of coffee into the Sephardic world, and so that it seemed to start among the Kabbalists, like in Turkey and in Sephardic lands, at the same time that coffee was finally introduced from the East into those lands, and so it made it easier to stay up all night. And as we all know, they also would have been lands where people were keeping Ramadan and where people were eating at night. Now, so like and Lincoln brings this up as like, well, there's the other thing, which is they got it from the locals and maybe something to do with Ramadan, maybe, or something. But I actually think that that's very more likely. But then still raises the question, which is that, but why stay up all night eating dairy instead of eating meat. I mean, my feeling is how much meat can you eat through the night? And I assume that Muslims eat meat at night during Ramadan, but it'd be interesting to find out if there's sort of cultural customs in Muslim lands of, oh, at Ramadan, don't eat lots of meat at night. It'll mess you up for the day. Because obviously they have to eat it at dark and stop at sunrise. So I just wanted to bring that up, because that's always been my favorite hypothesis, even if it's people consider it not the right one.
Yeah, no, well, I know you break the fast with a date. That's traditional. I don't know about the coffee part. I do know that in the 60s, a pediatrician named William Sackett, who it became very influential and wrote sort of a challenger to Spock, wrote a popular book, and came down very hard on milk. There was a whole chapter on milk is the absolute worst thing you can feed a child. And he suggested substituting coffee. So he was recommending, he like perhaps our early Kabbalists definitely recommended coffee, though he was recommending it for infants, under a year old, and for told parents who were uptight about the idea of giving their children coffee or soda, that they could give them Sanka. They could give them decaf if they're really worried about the caffeine.
That's amazing.
Mhm.
Well, as someone who loves dairy with my coffee, I mean, I occasionally will have espresso, but I think it's like chocolate. I think putting a little dairy in coffee brings out the flavor. So I'd like to think the Kabbalists, I mean, clearly the tradition of staying up all night precedes the Kabbalists. It's rabbinic, but it's not that common. I mean, maybe the Seder, they stayed up to the morning, but it was considered, a super duper virtuous thing to do, but to become a common practice seems to be connected with their ability to drink coffee through the night. So maybe I'd like to think that the dairy with coffee made sense to them as it made sense to me. Well, Jenny, thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead.
My pleasure. And I'll say next year we should invite Shachar Pinsker, our congregant, who is sort of an expert on Jewish cafe culture, and I'm sure would have a lot to share on the role of coffee in
so prior to the pandemic, Shachar and I had talked about having a joint talk where he did cafe culture, and I roasted and shared a variety of fresh and baristed you guys some drinks, and so for his talk.
Well, thank you for joining me. Thank you for those who messaged me. I want to follow up on some interesting things you raised there, and I look forward to learning more. So Chag Sameach to all. I hope you have a holiday flowing with milk and honey in the best possible way.
Same to you. Thank you so much. Chag Sameach, everybody.
Chag Sameach.